Hey, everybody. Since you're home, we decided to do chapel home also. So here we are in the House to Hope, the campus ministry's home. And we're talking this morning about keeping hope. And that's going to be kind of the theme that we use for the next few weeks. And so keeping hope, here we've got our hand sanitizer, we've got coffee, and we've got the Bible. Those are three ways you can all keep hope. I want to talk for a little bit this morning about a verse, and it's a verse in 1 Thessalonians 4. And the verse says, grieve, but don't grieve like those who have no hope. And I think one way that we can authentically be a people who stay hopeful, who keep our hope, even in the midst of uncertain times and times full of anxiety and questions and lots of emotions, one way we can keep our hope is to do what Paul says, to grieve. And I think what that means is that we authentically embrace the negative emotions that we're all feeling. There's all kinds of disappointment. There's all kinds of, things have been canceled and trips have been canceled and athletics have been canceled. And so there's all kinds of disappointment that goes along with this. There's anxiety, there's anger, there's all kinds of negative emotions. And I think one way that we have to go through this to keep our hope is that we have to just embrace those emotions. And that means we have to grieve. But it also means that we don't grieve like those who have no hope. I think one thing Paul is saying when he says that is that there's different ways to grieve. One way to grieve is to simply suppress your emotions, to ignore the negative emotions. And don't do that. That's not a good approach because the negative emotions will erupt at some point. And when they erupt, it'll destroy you. Another way to grieve is to grieve without hope at all. And that's when grieving just turns to mourning. It just turns to despair. And don't do that also. What instead you should do is to grieve, but marinate your grief. Marinate the negative feelings that you have. Marinate those in hope. I want to talk to you for a minute or two about one of the periods of my life where I went through an incredibly difficult time. And for me, it was when I lost my parents. It was the hardest time of my life. It was the hardest spiritual time of my life. My dad died in 2013 after a long battle with cancer. He was young. He was only 60 years old when he died. And the same year he died, my mom was diagnosed with a totally different thing. And she died 2.5 years later. She was 63. And so in the course of 2.5 years, I had these two giant pillars of my life just knocked out. And I found myself asking God, why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this to me? And that essentially is the same question that Mary and Joseph asked Jesus in Luke 2. And there's this funny little story in Luke 2, but it's become one of the stories in Jesus' life that I really love. It's when Jesus is 12 years old, so it's this junior high Jesus, and he wanders off. He wanders off into the big city of Jerusalem, and he, apparently, according to the Bible, he does it deliberately. He deliberately stays behind when his parents are leaving the city. He wanders off and goes into the temple. And his parents look for 3 days. They spend 3 days trying to find him, and they finally find Jesus. And when Mary and Joseph find Jesus, Mary's mad. She's mad that Jesus has done this to her. And she says to Jesus, she says, why have you done this to me, Jesus? I've followed you. I've loved you. I've done what you've asked me to do. Why have you done this to me? And Jesus' response to her is totally confusing. What he says, he responds to her question with another question. And his question is, why were you looking for me? It's a totally confusing response because he's a 12-year-old kid lost in the big city. So why were they looking for him? They were looking for him because they lost their kid in the big city. It's a totally confusing response. And at some point in your walk with Jesus, if you're not there right now, you will find yourself in a moment like Mary's having, where you find yourself asking Jesus, why are you doing this to me? And the response you get back from Jesus is totally confusing, something that doesn't make any sense. And one takeaway there is that Jesus is confusing. He's just confusing. He deliberately hides himself from his parents for 3 days. He teaches all throughout his ministry. He teaches in these parables that most people don't really understand. He falls asleep in a boat in the middle of the storm. And when his followers want him to lead a revolution, he instead submits himself to the Roman authorities and lets himself die. He does these things all throughout his ministry that are totally confusing. But what's clear, what's abundantly clear when you read the whole Gospels, is that despite the fact that Jesus does these confusing things, he's also someone we can trust. And the next thing Jesus says, so Mary says, why have you done this to us? Jesus responds with a question. His question is, why were you looking for me? And the next thing he says is, didn't you know I had to be here in my Father's house? And that word had, he's saying, I had to be here. That word had means that it's predetermined. It means somehow it's part of a plan. Now, he doesn't describe what the plan is. But the fact that he's saying, I had to be here, means that somehow this is part of a plan. And that's the case all through Jesus' life. He's doing these confusing things, but it is part of a plan. And one of the most famous verses in all of the Bible is Romans 8:28. And Romans 8:28 says, God will work all things together for good in the end. And what that means for you is that if you're going through a time right now, which we all are, a time where we don't see a lot of good right now, that simply means that it's not the end yet. If you don't see the good yet, it simply means it's not the end yet. What that means is that God is still writing your testimony. And what we can do is we can live with hope because we know what the end is. And the end is somehow going to be good. The whole Christian story is bad news, confusing news, disturbing news before it's good news. Jesus is born into disgrace, he's unjustly killed, and he's buried in a humiliating way. But then Easter comes. And Easter, among the myriad of things Easter does, is Easter turns the cross itself, which was once a symbol of capital punishment, the cross becomes our ultimate symbol of hope. And that's what God does. He takes bad things and transforms them into good things. And that is the gospel story. That is why we can marinate our grief with hope, because we know how the story ends. We know that somehow all of this will be worked out together for good. And so I leave you with that you can keep your hope in the middle of these trying times, because we know how the story ends. And it ends with hope. It ends with good news.